In the days when people thought sneezing was a sign of demonic possession and bathing could kill you, one brave soul made the worst career choice imaginable. He became a medieval doctor. Meet Bartholomew Poxworthy, a man armed with a diploma he couldn't read, a pouch of leeches he called the boys, and a scent that could clear a tavern faster than a tax collector. His job, to cure everything from plague to heartbreak, using boiled moss, rusty spoons, and prayers whispered over moldy bread. He wasn't paid well, he wasn't respected, and half his patients tried to bite him. So, fluff your pillow, dim the torchlight, and prepare to drift off to the soothing sounds of medieval malpractice. This is not a tale of triumph. It's a tale of boils, bad guesses, and bedtime-worthy blunders. And hey, if you enjoy tales of historical suffering told with sleepy sarcasm, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from where you're watching, preferably somewhere with fewer leeches. Bartholomew Poxworthy didn't choose the medical life. The medical life chose him, mostly because he was the only boy in his village who could spell phlegm without crying. His journey began in a dusty monastery school, where he was taught that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were cheerful, you had too much blood. If you were grumpy, too much black bile. If you were dead, well, that was usually blamed on a bad moon or an angry saint. Bartholomew studied hard. He memorized Latin phrases like inflammatio pustularum maximus, which loosely translates to "you've got a nasty boil," and learned to diagnose illnesses by sniffing urine and occasionally tasting it. He passed his final exam by correctly identifying a drawing of a spleen and not fainting during a live leech demonstration. His diploma was a scroll sealed with wax and goat hair. It read, "Physical Adept, may God help you." And just like that, he was a doctor. His first patient was a farmer with a limp. Bartholomew prescribed a poultice made of mashed turnips and owl feathers. The farmer died 3 days later, but his limp was gone. So technically, it was a success. Word spread quickly. "He's not great," people said, "but he's better than the barber." Bartholomew opened a clinic in a shed behind the tavern. It smelled of garlic, mold, and ambition. His tools included a rusty spoon, a jar of leeches named the boys, and a book of remedies that included instructions like rub vigorously with badger fat and chant softly while applying goose grease. He was ready. He was confident. He was about to regret everything, because being a medieval doctor wasn't just about healing. It was about guessing, loudly, while covered in someone else's fluids. Bartholomew Poxworthy loved his leeches, not in a normal, healthy way, more like how a lonely man might love his collection of haunted dolls. He kept them in a jar labeled the boys, which he carried everywhere, like a medieval emotional support animal. They were slimy, squishy, and always hungry, just like his patients. In the 1300s, leeches were considered the Swiss Army knife of medicine. Got a headache? Leeches. Sore throat? Leeches. Existential dread? More leeches. The logic was simple. If you were sick, it meant your humors were out of balance. And what better way to fix that than by letting a worm suck your blood until you fainted? Bartholomew would begin each treatment by dramatically unscrewing the jar and whispering, "Time to work, gentlemen." The leeches, sensing blood and bad decisions, would wriggle with enthusiasm. Patients were less thrilled. "Is that thing blinking at me?" one woman asked, backing away from the examination table. "No, no," Bartholomew assured her. "That's just its feeding face." He had names for them, too. Sir Suckleton, Lady Gush, Count Drainula. He claimed naming them improved their morale. Others claimed it was a sign he needed help. One particularly memorable evening, Bartholomew attempted to treat a baker's sprained ankle with a full leech bath. The baker screamed. The leeches escaped. The tavern was evacuated. The bread was never the same. Despite the chaos, Bartholomew stood by his methods. "They're more reliable than monks," he muttered, cleaning leech slime off his robe. "And they don't judge me when I cry." Bartholomew Poxworthy believed in science. Well, medieval science, which was mostly guesswork wrapped in Latin and sprinkled with superstition. At the heart of his medical philosophy were the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These weren't just bodily fluids. They were personality types, mood indicators, and the reason your neighbor thought he was a duck. If you were cheerful, you had too much blood. If you were cranky, too much black bile. If you were sluggish, phlegm. And if you were angry and slightly crispy, yellow bile. The cure? Remove some of the offending humor, preferably with leeches, or a spoon. Bartholomew kept a chart in his clinic, hand-drawn, slightly smudged, and entirely useless. It featured 4 blobs labeled sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic, each with a doodle of a sad potato representing the mood. One day, a knight came in complaining of battle fatigue. Bartholomew examined his tongue, sniffed his armpit, and declared, "You've got excessive choler. I recommend a cold bath, a prayer to St. Elbow, and 3 days of boiled cabbage." The knight punched him. Another patient, a nun with hiccups, was diagnosed with wandering phlegm. Bartholomew prescribed a leech necklace and a lullaby. She left quietly. The hiccups stayed. Despite the failures, Bartholomew remained committed. He even tried to balance his own humors by drinking wine, crying into a bucket, and occasionally licking a rock for earth energy. His assistant, a boy named Wiggins, once asked, "Master, what if the humors aren't real?" Bartholomew stared at him, horrified. "Then I've been rubbing goose grease on people for nothing." Bartholomew Poxworthy had a complicated relationship with the plague. On one hand, it made him famous. On the other hand, it kept trying to kill him. It began with a sneeze. One morning, a baker named Elfrida sneezed in the marketplace. People screamed. A goat fainted. Someone threw a cabbage. Within minutes, Bartholomew was summoned to contain the situation, which mostly involved waving garlic and shouting Latin until everyone calmed down. He diagnosed Elfrida with mild wind imbalance and prescribed boiled nettles and a week of silence. She recovered. The goat did not. But the real plague, the big one, arrived on a Tuesday. It came with rats, pustules, and a general sense of doom. Bartholomew tried to stay optimistic. "Maybe it's just aggressive acne," he whispered, as the town bell tolled ominously. His treatments were creative. He recommended wearing a dead weasel around the neck for spiritual protection, drinking wine mixed with crushed emeralds for internal sparkle, screaming into a bucket for emotional release. None of these worked, but they did distract people from their symptoms. Bartholomew also invented a plague mask, a beak filled with herbs, which made him look like a confused bird. with boundary issues. Children cried, chickens attacked. He wore it proudly. At one point, he tried to quarantine the sick by locking them in the tavern. This backfired when they drank all the ale and started a polka band called the Festering Minstrels. Despite the chaos, Bartholomew remained committed. He scribbled notes, collected samples, and occasionally yelled at clouds. "I will defeat this plague," he declared. Moments before, tripping over a rat and falling into a barrel of pickled onions, Bartholomew Poxworthy didn't believe in bathing, not because he was lazy, though he was, but because medieval science insisted that water could seep into your bones and make your soul slippery. Instead, he practiced dry hygiene, which involved rubbing himself with herbs, ashes, and occasionally a roasted onion. His scent was legendary. People could smell him before they saw him. Birds flew away. Candles flickered. One monk fainted. But in the 1300s, smelling awful was a sign of status. The more pungent the physician, people said, the more potent the poultice. Bartholomew took this to heart. He wore a robe soaked in vinegar, garlic, and goat sweat, a combination he called the medicinal musk. His clinic smelled like a battlefield between spices and despair. Patients entered bravely, clutching lavender sprigs and holding their breath. One woman brought a live ferret to sniff instead of air. The ferret passed out. Bartholomew's assistant, young Wiggins, once asked, "Master, why not wash?" Bartholomew looked offended. "Washing is for poets and plague victims. I am a man of science." He did, however, invent a cologne, a mixture of crushed mint, moldy bread, and something he found behind the tavern. He called it Essence of Enlightenment. It smelled like regret. Despite the stench, Bartholomew was popular. People believed his odor warded off evil spirits. One noblewoman hired him to stand near her garden to keep away aphids. He charged extra for wind direction. Bartholomew Poxworthy's medical toolkit looked less like something you'd find in a hospital, and more like something you'd find in a haunted shed behind a suspicious butcher shop. There was the bone saw, which doubled as a bread knife, the eye spoon, which had never successfully removed an eye, but had stirred many unfortunate soups, and the tooth chisel, which was really just a rusty nail with ambition. He kept everything in a leather satchel that smelled like despair and pickled onions. Patients often asked, "Is that safe?" To which Bartholomew would reply, "Define safe." His favorite tool was the bloodletting basin, a shallow bowl engraved with the words, "For the greater good," and a doodle of a screaming chicken. He used it for everything, draining humors, mixing poultices, and once, as a hat during a particularly windy diagnosis. There was also the boil lance, a sharp stick he claimed was blessed by Saint Pustula, patron saint of skin eruptions. It had a 40% success rate and a 100% scream rate. For internal issues, he used the rectal funnel, which was exactly what it sounds like, and absolutely not something you want described in detail before bed. Let's just say it involved goose grease and a prayer for forgiveness. Bartholomew's assistant, Wiggins, once asked, "Master, why not invent gentler tools?" Bartholomew sighed. "Gentle tools don't get results or dramatic reactions. Medicine is half science, half theater." Bartholomew Poxworthy didn't diagnose illnesses. He performed them. Each patient encounter was a theatrical event, part interpretive dance, part wild guessing, and part sniff test. He'd enter the room dramatically, robes billowing, leech jar rattling, and declare, Let us discover what ails thee through the sacred art of squinting. His process was simple. Sniff the patient. If they smelled like onions, it was probably soul congestion. If they smelled like despair, it was melancholic spleen fog. Tap the forehead. A hollow sound meant excess wind. A thud meant too much earth. A scream meant start over. Ask confusing questions. Have you recently offended a goose? Do your dreams taste like vinegar? Has your bile been unusually chatty? Stare into the distance and mutter Latin. This step was mostly for dramatic effect. It made patients feel like something important was happening. It wasn't. One day, a blacksmith came in with a sore elbow. Bartholomew sniffed him, tapped his knee, and diagnosed wandering bile with a touch of spiritual hiccups. He prescribed a poultice made of moss, regret, and a single boiled shoe. The blacksmith left confused. His elbow remained sore. His shoe was never seen again. Another patient, a shepherd with itchy feet, was diagnosed with hoof envy. Bartholomew recommended walking backward for 3 days while humming the national anthem of goats. The shepherd complied. The goats were flattered. Bartholomew's assistant, Wiggins, once asked, "Master, do you ever get it right?" Bartholomew smiled. "Occasionally, but mostly, I aim for memorable." Bartholomew Poxworthy was a man of science, but also, tragically, a man of feelings, and nothing stirred his heart quite like a well-aged poultice. He believed romance and medicine were deeply intertwined. After all, what said "I adore you" more than a salve made of crushed beetles and fermented gooseberries? His attempts at courtship were unconventional. One spring morning, he fell for a local candlemaker named Beatrix, whose hands smelled faintly of beeswax and disappointment. To woo her, Bartholomew crafted a love potion using rose petals, vinegar, and a dash of powdered frog. He presented it in a goblet shaped like a kidney. Beatrix drank it. She sneezed, hiccuped, and declared she could now hear colors. She left shortly after, muttering something about romantic poisoning. Undeterred, Bartholomew tried again, this time with a bouquet of herbs tied together with leech string. "For your humors," he whispered, "and possibly your ankles." She declined. Politely, with mace, his assistant Wiggins tried to intervene. "Master, perhaps less frog and fewer kidneys." Bartholomew sighed. But love is a delicate balance of bile and bravery. He even wrote poetry. "O Beatrix, my spleen sings for thee, like a boil yearning to be lanced. Thy eyes like tinctures burn my soul, and thy elbows are medically advanced." It didn't help. Eventually, Bartholomew gave up on romance and focused on remedies. He poured his heart into concoctions that cured hiccups, soothed boils, and occasionally turned people purple. He called it emotional alchemy. Bartholomew Poxworthy had many professional rivals, but none grated his nerves, quite like Cedric, the barber surgeon, a man who could trim your beard, lance your boils, and insult your mother all in one sitting. Cedric's shop was across the street from Bartholomew's clinic, marked by a spinning pole and a sign that read, "Haircuts, bloodletting, and casual amputations. Walk-ins, welcome." Bartholomew found this offensive. "Medicine is a sacred art," he muttered, watching Cedric sharpen a blade with the enthusiasm of a man preparing for a duel, not a side hustle between beard trims. The feud began when a nobleman with a swollen knee visited Bartholomew for treatment. Bartholomew diagnosed fluid imbalance due to melancholic moon exposure. and prescribed a compress of boiled cabbage and whispered apologies. The nobleman wasn't impressed. He limped across the street to Cedric, who drained the knee with a rusty knife, slapped on a bandage, and gave him a complimentary eyebrow shaping. The nobleman declared Cedric a genius. Bartholomew declared him a reckless lunatic. Their rivalry escalated quickly. Bartholomew posted a sign, "No haircuts, just healing." Cedric responded with, "No guesswork, just results." Bartholomew began wearing a robe embroidered with Latin phrases. Cedric countered by wearing a tunic made of bandages and confidence. One afternoon, they both arrived at the town square to treat a farmer who had fainted from heat and possibly boredom. Bartholomew began chanting a diagnosis involving spleen vapors. Cedric poured ale on the farmer's face and yelled, "Wake up, you lazy turnip." The farmer sat up, burped, and declared Cedric the winner. Bartholomew was livid. "That's not medicine, that's pub behavior." Cedric winked. "Pub behavior works, and it comes with snacks." Despite their differences, the townsfolk loved them both. Bartholomew for his dedication and dramatic flair, Cedric for his speed, sarcasm, and ability to remove a mole while trimming a mustache. Wiggins, ever the diplomat, suggested a truce. "Perhaps you could collaborate." Bartholomew scoffed. "I'd rather bathe in leech water." Cedric overheard. "I offer leech baths on Thursdays. Half price." Bartholomew Poxworthy had many enemies: plague, logic, and occasionally gravity, but none were as persistent or as fragrant as Gregory the apothecary. Gregory ran a shop 2 doors down from Bartholomew's clinic. It was filled with colorful jars, mysterious powders, and the overwhelming scent of lavender and passive aggression. He wore silk robes, spoke in rhyming couplets, and claimed his potions could cure anything from gout to heartbreak to spiritual bloating. Bartholomew hated him. "He's a glorified spice merchant," Bartholomew muttered, watching Gregory hand a customer a vial labeled moon juice for moody knees. That man once tried to treat a broken leg with cinnamon and optimism. The feud began over a patient named Mildred, who had a persistent cough and a tendency to narrate her symptoms in song. Bartholomew prescribed boiled nettles and silence. Gregory offered throat elixir of the elven mist. Mildred chose Gregory. She also developed hiccups that sounded like yodels. Bartholomew retaliated by placing a sign outside his clinic. "Real medicine. No pixie dust." Gregory responded with his own sign. "No rusty spoons. No screaming." Things escalated. Bartholomew released a pamphlet titled Apothecaries, the Perfumed Menace. Gregory hosted a herbal healing gala and invited everyone except Bartholomew, who showed up anyway and was escorted out by a man dressed as a sentient mushroom. One day, Bartholomew caught Gregory selling anti-plague perfume made of rosewater and crushed beetles. "This is fraud," he shouted. Gregory smiled. "It's aromatherapy, with a hint of drama." Their rivalry became legendary. Children placed bets. Rats avoided both shops. The mayor declared Tuesdays no fighting over Tinctures Day. Despite the bitterness, Bartholomew secretly admired Gregory's flair. "He's wrong," he whispered, "but he's stylishly wrong." Bartholomew Poxworthy had many fears: plague, papal audits, and accidentally prescribing goose grease for heartbreak. But his greatest fear was patients with teeth. One such patient was old Agnes, a woman of indeterminate age and infinite rage. She arrived at Bartholomew's clinic with a limp, a scowl, and a sack full of turnips she claimed were emotional support vegetables. Bartholomew greeted her with his usual charm. Welcome, dear madam. What seems to be the trouble? My leg's possessed, she growled. It keeps twitching like it's trying to escape. Bartholomew nodded, sagely. Classic case of wandering humors. We'll need a leech, a prayer, and possibly a small exorcism. He reached for Sir Suckleton, his most enthusiastic leech, and gently placed it on her ankle. Agnes screamed. Not a normal scream, more like the sound of a banshee stepping on a Lego. She grabbed a nearby ladle and swung it with surprising accuracy, knocking over the jar of essence of enlightenment and sending Wiggins diving for cover. You call that medicine? She bellowed. You're just a fancy worm farmer. Bartholomew tried to calm her. Madam, please. The leech is working. Look, it's already bloated with your suffering. That's when she bit him, right on the forearm, with the force of 1,000 angry turnips. Bartholomew yelped, dropped the leech, and stumbled backward into the shelf of questionable tinctures. A bottle labeled, "Do not use unless desperate or drunk," shattered on the floor. Agnes stood triumphant, leg twitching, mouth foaming slightly, from rage and possibly elderberry fumes. I feel better already, she declared, and limped out, leaving behind a trail of turnips and emotional damage. Bartholomew sat in silence, nursing his bite wound and questioning his life choices. Wiggins peeked out from under the table. Should I add bite-proof gloves to the supply list? Bartholomew sighed. Add a helmet and a priest. Bartholomew Poxworthy had seen many things in his career. Haunted ankles, angry monks, and a man who claimed his spleen could predict the weather. But nothing prepared him for the day the cyst exploded. It began innocently enough. A farmer named Oswald arrived at the clinic with a lump on his shoulder, the size of a small loaf of bread, and roughly the same texture. It's been growing, Oswald said, and occasionally hums. Bartholomew examined it with his usual flair, sniffing, tapping, and whispering Latin phrases that may or may not have been recipes. Ah, he declared, a classic case of tumorous squishicus. We'll lance it gently. Wiggins, ever the cautious assistant, raised a hand. Should we wear gloves? Bartholomew scoffed. Gloves are for cowards and apothecaries. He selected his finest boil lance, a stick sharpened by time and questionable decisions, and approached the cyst like a knight facing a dragon made of pudding. Brace yourself, he whispered to Oswald. This may tingle. It did not tingle. It erupted. With a sound like a wet sneeze in a cathedral, the cyst burst forth in a glorious geyser of goo. The walls were splattered. The ceiling was baptized. Wiggins screamed and dove behind a barrel of emergency vinegar. Oswald blinked. I feel lighter. Bartholomew stood frozen, dripping with triumph and something that smelled faintly of onions and betrayal. Success, he said, wiping his face with a scroll he'd meant to frame. The aftermath was legendary. The townsfolk called it the Great Gooning. Children sang songs. The mayor issued a mop. The local artist painted a mural titled The Day the Lump Fought Back. Bartholomew, ever the optimist, added cyst eruption to his list of specialties. He even considered bottling the residue as a skin tonic until Wiggins threatened to quit. It was a quiet evening in the village of Grumble-on-Ditch. The moon hung low, the owls were hooting in Latin, and Bartholomew Poxworthy was elbow deep in a jar of pickled leeches when the monastery bell rang with alarming urgency. Moments later, a frantic novice burst into the clinic, panting and pale. Brother Gregory is possessed, he cried. He's making sounds. Bartholomew sighed, wiped his hands on a curtain that may have once been white, and grabbed his emergency exorcism kit, which was really just his regular medical bag with a cross drawn on it in chalk. At the monastery, chaos reigned. Monks were praying, chanting, and hiding behind pews. Brother Gregory sat in the middle of the chapel, clutching his stomach and groaning like a haunted accordion. He's been cursed, one monk wailed. He ate the cheese of St. Wilbur, and now the devil dances in his bowels. Bartholomew approached cautiously. Brother Gregory, can you describe your symptoms? The monk let out a sound that could only be described as a theological trumpet solo. Bartholomew nodded. Ah, yes. Classic case of flatulentus sanctificus. He examined the patient with his usual flair. A few pokes, a sniff, and a brief consultation with a nearby candle. He's not possessed, Bartholomew declared. He's just extremely enthusiastic in the digestive department. The monks gasped. You mean it's not a demon? No, Bartholomew said, but it might be the cheese. He prescribed a strict regimen of mint tea, silence, and a temporary vow of distance. Brother Gregory was relocated to the bell tower, where his emissions could be mistaken for divine wind. Wiggins, who had followed with a mop and a clothespin for his nose, whispered, Master, should we tell them it's just gas? Bartholomew shook his head. Let them believe it's a miracle. It's better for morale. The next morning, the monks reported that Brother Gregory's holy wind had cleared the crypt of bats and inspired 3 new hymns. They offered Bartholomew a wheel of cheese in thanks. He declined, politely, while backing away. Bartholomew Poxworthy believed in medicine. The church believed in miracles. Their relationship was tense. In medieval times, science was considered suspicious, especially if it involved touching organs or asking questions like, what does a spleen actually do? The church preferred answers like, it stores sin, or it's where guilt lives. Bartholomew once tried to dissect a frog to understand its anatomy. A monk saw him and screamed, witchcraft. The frog escaped. The monk fainted. The frog was later canonized as Saint Ribbit. Another time, Bartholomew suggested that illness might come from dirty water. The bishop gasped. Are you saying God's puddles are impure? Bartholomew tried to explain bacteria. The bishop tried to exorcise his shoes. To keep the peace, Bartholomew added religious flair to his treatments. He renamed his leeches the apostles. He blessed his poultices with holy water, or at least water that hadn't been used to soak turnips. He even wore a tiny halo made of bent spoons. Still, tensions remained. The church claimed prayer cured everything. Bartholomew claimed prayer cured boredom. One nun with a toothache was told to fast and chant. Bartholomew offered a tooth chisel and a strong ale. She chose the ale. The chanting continued anyway, mostly in pain. Wiggins, ever the voice of reason, asked, Master, can't you work with the church? Bartholomew sighed. I tried. They asked me to diagnose sin. I prescribed garlic. They were not amused. Eventually, Bartholomew learned to navigate the holy minefield. He treated monks with extra reverence, avoided saying spleen in sermons, and never ever mentioned frogs. Bartholomew Poxworthy had treated peasants, monks, and one very angry goose, but nothing prepared him for a summons from the royal palace. The king, His Majesty, King Percival the Flatulent, had a problem, a very private, very persistent problem. My rear, he declared, has betrayed me. Bartholomew arrived at court with his best robe, his cleanest spoon, and a scroll labeled, "Procedures we don't talk about." He was greeted by a nervous steward who whispered, "The king's bottom has gone rogue." The royal physician had fled days earlier, citing emotional trauma and excessive whiffage. Bartholomew was now the kingdom's last hope. He entered the royal chamber, where King Percival lay draped in silk and shame. "Fix me," the king groaned, "and do it discreetly. The court thinks I'm just moody." Bartholomew nodded solemnly. "Your Majesty, I shall examine the throne, behind the throne." The procedure was delicate. Bartholomew used his rectal funnel, a candle for morale, and a prayer to Saint Flatula, patron of uncomfortable silences. Wiggins stood nearby, holding a curtain and questioning his life choices. The diagnosis: royal blockage with a hint of rebellious wind. Bartholomew prescribed a diet of boiled figs and humility, a poultice made of mint, moss, and crushed royal decrees, and, most controversially, a gentle massage using a warmed turnip. The king was skeptical. "A turnip?" Bartholomew nodded. "Trust me, it's nature's plunger." After 3 days of treatment, the king declared himself cured. Trumpets were sounded. A feast was held. Bartholomew was knighted, though the sword accidentally poked him in the hip. From that day forward, he was known as Sir Bartholomew of the Back Passage, a title he accepted with pride and mild embarrassment. Bartholomew Poxworthy had heard many strange things in his career. That sneezing could eject demons, that left-handedness was a sign of goat ancestry, and that garlic cured heartbreak. But nothing baffled him more than the medieval medical marvel known as the wandering womb. According to the finest minds of the time, who had never actually spoken to a womb, it was believed that the uterus was a free-spirited organ, prone to travel. If a woman was feeling faint, anxious, or simply annoyed, the diagnosis was clear. Her womb had gone on holiday. "It's probably in her throat," one monk once whispered, "or her elbow." Bartholomew, ever the professional, took this theory very seriously. He even drew a map titled Probable Womb Migration Routes, which included pit stops at the spleen, the ears, and, for reasons unclear, the left knee. One day, a young woman named Hilda arrived at his clinic, clutching her chest and gasping. "Doctor," she wheezed, "I feel like something's crawling upward." Bartholomew nodded gravely. Classic case of womb wanderlust. He sprang into action, lighting a bundle of herbs and waving it around her ankles. "We must lure it back down," he explained. "Wombs hate rosemary." Wiggins, ever skeptical, asked, "Master, what if it's just anxiety?" Bartholomew scoffed. "Anxiety doesn't climb the spine and whisper secrets." He prescribed a regimen of smelling burnt lavender near the feet, singing lullabies to the abdomen, and wearing a belt made of warm bread to anchor the womb. Hilda was unconvinced. "Is this normal?" Bartholomew smiled. "Madam, your womb is simply adventurous. We must respect its journey, but also remind it where it lives." After a week of herbal foot baths and stern conversations with her midsection, Hilda reported feeling better, though she suspected it had more to do with the naps and less to do with the bread belt. Bartholomew declared the treatment a triumph. He added "womb whisperer" to his business cards, which were just bits of bark with his name scratched in. Bartholomew Poxworthy had always believed in the power of herbs. They could soothe a cough, calm a rash, and, if steeped long enough, make a person forget they'd ever had dignity. One foggy morning, he decided to create his magnum opus, a tonic so potent, so invigorating, it would awaken the soul and mildly confuse the liver. He called it Bartholomew's Elixir of Enlightenment and Occasional Dizziness. The ingredients were bold: mint for freshness, sage for wisdom, nettle for surprise, dandelion for whimsy, and a generous splash of fermented beet juice for chaos. He brewed it in a cauldron borrowed from the local blacksmith, who warned him it had previously held horseshoes and regret. Bartholomew waved off the concern. A little iron builds character. He distributed the tonic at the town square, offering free samples to anyone with a pulse and a questionable sense of adventure. The villagers drank eagerly. The effects were immediate. Mildred began reciting poetry in Latin, despite never learning Latin. Oswald danced with a wheelbarrow and declared it his soulmate. Brother Gregory claimed he could smell colors and taste guilt. Bartholomew was thrilled. Success, he cried. My elixir has unlocked their inner truths. Wiggins, however, was less impressed. Master, Mildred just tried to marry a cabbage. By nightfall, the village was a swirling mess of herbal euphoria. People sang, wept, and attempted interpretive cartwheeling. The mayor declared it the most productive hallucination we've ever had. But the next morning came the hangover. The villagers awoke with pounding heads, green tongues, and vague memories, confessing secrets to livestock. Mildred refused to speak to the cabbage. Oswald broke up with a wheelbarrow. Brother Gregory claimed divine punishment and hid in a barrel. Bartholomew, ever the optimist, offered a follow-up tonic, Bartholomew's soothing syrup of regret reduction. It tasted like boiled socks and worked about half the time. Wiggins sighed. Perhaps next time, fewer herbs? Bartholomew nodded. Or more socks. Bartholomew Poxworthy had faced many medical mysteries, haunted knees, rebellious spleens, and one man who claimed his hiccups were prophetic. But nothing spread fear quite like the arrival of the great pox. It began with a whisper. A traveling bard arrived in Grumble-on-Ditch with a suspicious rash and a lute that smelled like regret. He sang a song called Ode to My Spots, which was catchy, alarming, and medically concerning. By morning, half the village was scratching and the other half was panicking. Bartholomew was summoned immediately. It's the pox, the mayor cried. We're doomed. Bartholomew examined the bard, who was now covered in blotches and attempting to seduce a turnip. He muttered. Could be pox. Could be beet allergy. Could be cursed by a romantic goose. He declared a state of mild emergency and began his protocol. Step 1. Burn all suspicious undergarments. Step 2. Boil herbs until they scream. Step 3. Apply a poultice made of garlic, hope, and crushed apology letters. The villagers were not reassured. Rumors spread faster than symptoms. Some claimed the pox came from kissing frogs. Others blamed the apothecary's scented candles. One man insisted it was punishment for dancing too enthusiastically near a sacred shrub. Bartholomew tried to calm the chaos. He held a town meeting, passed out pamphlets titled, So You Think You've Got the Pox, and wore a hat shaped like a blister to normalize the experience. Wiggins, ever the voice of reason, asked, Master, do we even know what the pox is? Bartholomew shrugged. It's either a disease, a metaphor, or a very aggressive rash. Possibly all three. Eventually, the bard recovered after a week of mint baths and emotional journaling. The village relaxed. The turnip was returned to the market. Bartholomew declared victory and added Pox Wrangler to his list of titles. Bartholomew Poxworthy had never considered retirement, mostly because in medieval times, retirement wasn't a thing. You either worked until you died, or you died while working. Ideally, not during a rectal exam, but after decades of diagnosing imaginary illnesses, dodging angry monks, and being bitten by patients with haunted limbs, Bartholomew began to wonder, what comes next? He tried hobbies. Basket weaving ended in splinters. Falconry ended in screaming. Gardening ended when he mistook a turnip for a patient and tried to prescribe it nettle tea. One afternoon, while sipping lukewarm broth and staring at a wall that may or may not have been judging him, Bartholomew sighed. Perhaps it's time to hang up the leech jar. Wiggins, now older and slightly traumatized, nodded. You've earned it, master. You've cured boils, survived plagues, and invented at least 3 diseases. Bartholomew smiled. Yes, and I once treated a nobleman's rash with marmalade. That should count for something. He considered writing a memoir, Poxworthy's Pustules, a life in lumps. But the ink gave him hives, and the quill kept poking his dignity. Eventually, he settled on a simpler plan. He would retire the way most medieval doctors did, by dramatically announcing his departure, walking into the woods, and waiting for nature to make a decision. He packed his essentials: 1 spoon for emergencies, a pouch of dried herbs, mostly decorative, and a scroll labeled, "Do not resuscitate unless you're really good at it." The villagers gathered to bid him farewell. Mildred wept into a cabbage. Brother Gregory sang a hymn that sounded suspiciously like a burp. Cedric, the barber surgeon, offered a handshake and a sarcastic poem. Bartholomew waved, adjusted his robe, and walked into the misty forest, muttering Latin and occasionally arguing with squirrels. Some say he became a hermit. Others claim he merged with a tree and now dispenses advice in riddles. Wiggins swears he saw him once, riding a goat and shouting about spleens. Years after Bartholomew Poxworthy vanished into the woods with a spoon and a scroll, legends of his medical misadventures continue to ripple through the village of Grumble-on-Ditch like a rash no ointment could soothe. One such tale was whispered by candlelight in taverns and bathhouses, the epilogue of eczema. It began when a traveling merchant arrived with a mysterious itch. His elbows flaked like ancient parchment, and his knees squeaked when he walked. "It's the curse of the crumble," he declared dramatically. "I am shedding my dignity." The villagers panicked. Was it contagious? Was it divine punishment? Was it just dry weather and poor lotion habits? With no Bartholomew to consult, they turned to his legacy: a dusty chest in the town hall, labeled Poxworthy's Final Remedies and Mild Regrets. Inside were a jar of anti-itch elixir, which smelled like roasted socks, a scroll titled Eczema, the Flaky Frontier, and a note that read, "If all else fails, try butter," or denial. The merchant was slathered in the elixir, wrapped in cabbage leaves, and serenaded with a hymn Bartholomew once used to calm angry boils. Miraculously, the itching subsided. Or maybe he just got used to it. The villagers rejoiced. They declared it a medical victory and held a ceremony in Bartholomew's honor, featuring interpretive scratching and a statue made entirely of bandages. Wiggins, now the town's unofficial healer, stood proudly beside the statue. He was strange, he said, but he made medicine memorable. And so, dear reader, as the tale of Bartholomew Poxworthy comes to a close, we remember the man who diagnosed dancing shadows, cured royal bottoms, and faced eczema with courage, cabbage, and questionable confidence. Sleep tight. May your humors be balanced, your tinctures gentle, and your dreams flake free. Good night.